Well, in the USA, the Memorial Day weekend is the unofficial start of the summer season, with Labor Day being the unofficial closing of the summer time. Families head to the beaches and national, state, local parks. They go to rivers and lakes for a weekend of fun, picnics and camping. Well, I hope the folks in upstate New York and Vermont and other New England states wore winter coats and gloves and snowboat boots if they went to a nearby state park for a family picnic, because a rare winter storm in late May dropped 3 feet of snow on the region this past weekend. Meanwhile, folks in Hamilton, Canada, woke up to record cold temperatures this past weekend. In Holland, there's been frost on the ground in many parts of the country as temperatures dipped to nearly 3 degrees below Celsius. And Germany's spring is one of the coldest in memory, with higher elevations still receiving snowfall. Poor Al Gore. His global warming career is over. But he doesn't have any financial worries because he sold his little watch TV channel to the Arabs for $500 million, so Al's world will be warm and cozy for a long time anyhow. Now, I've been monitoring science reports for the past 5 years or so for evidence that our planet may be headed toward a new little ice age. And last week, I read a book entitled The Cold Sun. In fact, I stayed up really late at night reading it, and my wife woke up sometime around 2 a.m. and said, "You're still up?" And I said, I can't stop until I finish the book. So I read the entire book that night before going to sleep. The author is Mr. John Casey. He's been a national space policy advisor to the White House and Congress, a space shuttle engineer, a consultant to NASA, a consultant to the president of several leading-edge technology companies. He is currently the president of the Space and Science Research Corporation in nearby Orlando, Florida. This is his first time on the program. Mr. Casey, welcome to True News.
Well, good to be with you. Thank you for asking me, Rick.
Well, your book, The Cold Sun, it cost me some sleep that night. I stayed up and read it cover to cover, and I emailed our guest coordinator that night around 2:30 a.m. and said, "Get this man on the program." So I appreciate you coming on today. Let's start at the beginning. I gave a brief description of your professional career. When did you start becoming aware and concerned that something was unusual was happening with the sun?
The start of all this for me began in very early 2007. I was actually working on another book unrelated to climate, and a chapter in the book dealt with the sun's behavior and both past and predicted future behavior. And once I got into that and jumped into the deep physics of the sun and how it's operating, I detected some recurring patterns by looking at sunspot records going back 400 years. And it was pretty clear to me that there were regular patterns, cyclical behavior of the sun. So I spent a lot more time looking into it, and once I had finished it on April the 26th, 2007 at 2 p.m., I realized that a 206-year cycle of the sun had been driving global warming for that past 200 years and was about to reverse rapidly into a dangerous 30 to 40-year cold period, and that really began it all.
In addition to this solar cycle of 206 years, I've in recent years I've become aware that there are a lot of cycles that govern this world. And although I can't prove it, it's just my own hunch. I have a feeling that most of the global warming scientists know that this is a fact. I'm cynical enough. I believe that they used a global warming cycle as the catalyst to impose what I believe was going to be a global socialist government regime. And they knew all along that the cycle was reaching its peak in the early 21st century, and they missed it. They didn't succeed in getting passed through governments what they were hoping to accomplish. So we're now switching over. The planet is switching over now into this cooling cycle, and I think, Mr. Casey, what I want people to understand is that let's not deny global warming. It was warming for 200 years, but it's normal. It's natural. It wasn't man-made. The planet has gone through global warming cycles every 200 years, and then it goes through a cooling cycle, and so now we're at this stage where the planet is the thermostat is changing on the planet. Now, your book is called The Cold Sun. Why did you name it The Cold Sun?
Well, in keeping with your comments just now, we typically look at the sun as a source of heat. Very rarely do people consider it as something that brings cold. So the title was apropos for the new cold era caused by the sun. And the way it happens, of course, is that every 206 years the sun goes into this solar hibernation phase where it cuts back on the amount of energy that it distributes throughout the solar system, that same energy that warms the Earth. So when it reduces its heating and warming energy for the Earth gets colder. And it doesn't have to happen by a great deal. A very small amount of cutback on the part of the sun can make the difference between the past 20 years of global warming versus the period from 1600 to 1745 when we had a little ice age. A very small change, and we're frozen again. And that's really what's coming. We'll have a deep, long, cold period, somewhere between the cold period of the Dalton minimum around 1800 and the Maunder minimum during the 1600s. It'll be either way, it's going to be very difficult times for everyone on the planet because both cold periods, the 1800 period and the 1600 period, produce widespread starvation and crop losses around the planet. So not good news coming from the climate, but the good news is the truth is finally getting out that man-made greenhouse gas emissions have little or nothing to do with the climate, and in fact that all of this time and money we've thrown at it have created a cloud and a cover over what is really happening with Mother Nature, changing the climate as it regularly does every 206 years.
Now, in the past, I've interviewed scientists who've talked about the Dalton minimum and the Maunder minimum cycles, and those cycles are fewer years. Is there a grand minimum cycle? Is this 200-year cycle? Is this a grand cycle that these other cycles are inside this larger cycle?
Very well said. And going back to some of your earlier comments, there are, in fact, many, many cycles of the sun. There are many cycles much larger than the 206-year. There are a dozen cycles smaller than the 206-year. The reason for this new solar hibernation is it just so happens that the 206-year cycle is turning over. But we have much larger ones, and they do contribute to these grand minimums. Now, a grand minimum is defined in the field of solar physics as a period when the sun reduces its average sunspot count to 50 sunspots or less. The past cycles that we've been going through have had sunspot counts of 150, 175, all the way up to 200. So it's been a very active last 200 years. We've had fluctuations where the sun cuts back during that period. These are solar cycles less than 200 years that do bring colder periods, but nothing like what we're about to face.
Do you have any idea why the sun goes into a 200-year hibernation phase?
There are several theories that physicists have been looking at for decades, actually, and as you've aptly pointed out, most people that study the sun are well aware of these cycles and well aware of how they coincide almost 90 to 100% with temperature variation on the Earth. The sun is a vast energetic ball of energy, of course. There are, I guess historically, even since you and I went to high school, we were taught that the Earth is, or the sun is just basically a vast hydrogen bomb going off where hydrogen is converted into helium in the inner core at between 20 and 35 million degrees centigrade. And at that point, atoms break down, energy is released, and that's why the sun does what it does. But the sun also is affected by the gravitational pull of the 8 planets around us, and those planets alter the actual position of the sun in the middle of the solar system, just enough to where it can produce a 178-year cycle of movement. That 178-year cycle, when you combine it with other factors such as the tilt of the Earth, the position of the Earth, and the wobble of the Earth's axis, all combine to give us these 206-year cycles, 400-year cycles, 1,600, 2,500-year cycles, on and on and on. All of these variations in both how the sun creates its energy and the position of the planets and the position of the sun create all of these various cycles.
John, did you notice last week the BBC reported that there is an unexplained, their word, standstill in global warming? Are you noticing how the mainstream news media is struggling to spin the obvious cooling of the planet?
It's very difficult for them. Yes, indeed. I became intimately aware of this after I had a TV news conference July 1st, 2008, and issued a formal declaration that global warming had ended.
Oh, you said that in 2008? I bet that went over really well.
Oh, yes. Well, my first press release is right after my discovery in April and May of 2007. Likewise, it was a message no one wanted to hear, clearly. I mean, this was at a time when Al Gore and Dr. Pachauri at the UN were getting the Nobel Prize. Inconvenient Truth was a big play globally. And both presidential candidates, Senator Obama and Senator McCain, were both saying that man-made global warming was real, we were the cause, and they were both going to fix it. So when I stood up in a very loud manner and said, not only is it not caused by man, but global warming is ending and has ended. I said it was going to end in 2007, and in 2008 it had clearly ended. So we had the press conference at that point. But yes, it went over like a lead balloon. No one wanted to hear what I was saying. Because
they were on the march to Copenhagen at that time. Copenhagen was the grand finale of the propaganda campaign, and they had the Copenhagen summit planned. What was that, 2010 or 9? I forget which year it was. And this was the summit where they were going to implement their grand scheme to save the planet. I mean, Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, he said we have 50 years left to save the planet. And what happened? They got to Copenhagen, and God sent a snowstorm. The Copenhagen Global Warming Summit got snowed out. And
even the Rio Plus 20 summit the other year was the coldest ever recorded in Rio.
That's right. I forgot about that one also. So that proves God has a sense of humor, and he's made these people look like fools. Okay, what were the when was the last little ice age?
The last little ice age was from 1615 to 1745. Although some people do extend it to 1830, I do not, because there were two discrete solar cycles in play. The 400-year cycle was in play at 1600, and the 206-year cycle became more prominent in the Dalton minimum, which was 1793 to 1830. So I break them apart as two different cooling events. But the Little Ice Age.
So there were two cycles.
About 150 years.
There were two cycles happening simultaneously at that time.
In the 1600 period, yes, two cycles on top of each other, and in the 1800s, only the 206-year cycle was at play then. But both produced dramatically cold eras globally, massive crop damage, and massive starvation and loss of life by people freezing to death.
Take a few minutes and talk about what historical records tell us took place on the planet at that time.
Well, if you look at the last period from 1793 to 1830, and the coldest period was right about 1810, 1820 in there, say 1800, 1820. That period was so cold that historian John D. Post said it was the world's greatest subsistence crisis ever recorded. Now, what he meant by that was that the crop damage and the starvation globally was so bad that it was the worst time the human race has ever had in terms of finding enough food to live on. Now, at that time, we only had 1 billion people on the planet. Now we have, approaching the next bottom era, next minimum, almost 8 billion or more. So the challenge is going to be much worse. But in terms of records, historian John D. Post covered it very well. There's a lot of other historical records going back to even Thomas Jefferson, who during that same period lost his crops. He had to take out a bank loan because everything froze. And if you go back and look at the Mormon Church, a lot of the Mormon Church records show that so many people died and froze in New England during that period that they moved out of New England, and that actually led to them moving to Ohio and later to Utah, where the Mormon Church was founded. So a lot of our history is based on climate. We don't realize it, but that includes a lot of U.S. history. Look at the activities of the French and how they supported us both in the Revolutionary War and again in 1812 when the British were coming in and burning down the capital. Fortunately, the War of 1812 was mostly a oceanic war, a naval war, and thanks for the French fighting the British at that time, the French kept most of the naval resources fighting in Europe, which allowed us to win what we did in the War of 1812. But again, that was during the bitter cold era of the Dalton Minimum. So a lot of our history is driven by these cold eras, and certainly that period had lots of documentation. The prior era did not. The Little Ice Age did not have nearly as much historical records, so we had to go back to Europe to find out what was going on over there. There wasn't much of America at all, of course, in 1600.
I know I've seen reports that the Mississippi River was frozen solid, that wagon trains would cross over the Mississippi. I've seen records that there were years that the Mississippi was frozen at the mouth at the Gulf of Mexico. Have you seen those kind of historical records?
I've seen no record of that, but clearly major waterways were frozen over during the Little Ice Age, both in the U.S. and in Europe. The port of New York, as it was back then, was completely frozen over. You could walk between Staten and Ellis Island and Manhattan on the ice. It was so cold. The Philadelphia River was frozen over. In Europe, the Thames River in Great Britain was frozen over so often that they had ice festivals out on the ice. The Baltic Sea, north of Holland, as you mentioned earlier, was frozen over so often that they built communities, hotels, stores, roadways on the frozen Baltic Sea, and could go walk and ride between countries because it was so cold and so frozen. It was just a very, very cold era.
John, what are we talking about only the Northern Hemisphere? How does this play out in other parts of the world?
It includes the entire globe. In fact, the southern hemisphere tends to lead in terms of getting colder first, and that's why we've seen the Antarctic still getting colder and colder, and has been for 30 years now, despite all of what Al Gore has told us about the Antarctic melting and flooding the world's major cities and coastlines. That has always been a lie. It has never been true. The Antarctic continues to get colder. The ice continues to form, and we just recently set a record for the winter ice that effectively, is frozen sea ice off the continent that doubles the size of Antarctica every year. Just set a record for new sea ice recently. So the southern hemisphere tends to lead. It's already begun there. And now we've had major new cold climate indicators in the northern hemisphere, so now we're falling in line. The Pacific Ocean, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is the temperature of the northern Pacific, has been dropping for 30 years and is now heading into its coldest era. The northern Atlantic, which has just passed its peak of warming and is now heading much lower in temperature.
Will that reduce the risk of hurricanes?
Fundamentally, yes. You should see fewer and less intense storms in the next 30 and 40 years because the water will simply be cooler. That doesn't mean we're not going to have hurricanes at all. In fact, during the last cold era, the last 206-year cycle in the 1800s, we had hurricanes then too. British ships documented hurricane activity, but it certainly won't be anything to compare with what we just finished as the peak of global warming has passed. Mm-hmm. By the way, the warming that creates the hurricanes, of course, is tropical ocean temperature and wind patterns. The tropics are that area of the globe that is dropping the fastest in terms of temperature decline.
Go ahead and explain that.
Well, we monitor global temperature in our company for our global climate status report. By the way, the next version of that is due out here in about 2 weeks. But we are the only science group studying climate that publishes a global climate status report. You can go to our website, spaceandscience.net. You go to the publication page. You can download the free executive summary. It tells you all about the status. You can order the full 52-page report, or you can just wait a couple of weeks and get the new version. Bottom line is we monitor 24 climate parameters, including temperatures in the tropics, the North and South Atlantic, North and South Pacific. We monitor solar activity. We monitor the polar regions in terms of ice depth and extent. Many other factors are considered. And of those 24 parameters, in the first report, the last one that just came out, 20 of the 24 global climate temperature and other parameters showed global cooling was in place.
Last Saturday morning, when I was looking at the weather map and a map of the USA and the temperatures for thousands of communities, and it was very clear. You could see the demarcation line going from east to west, north and south. Above a certain region, New England, Pennsylvania, Ohio, going across the northern part of the United States. It had dipped down into the 30s that night, Friday night, Saturday morning, and then clearly, south of that line, it was temperatures were in the 40s and 50s and 60s. What are we typically during this 206-year cycle for North America? What are we going to see as typical temperatures in each season?
If you look at the global temperature, it will vary by 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but on a global basis, that translates to 5 to 10 degrees cooler temperatures here in the continental U.S. on average. That means that the typical high 90 temperatures we see here in Florida will become high 80 and low 90 temperatures. It means that and what's most important, that 5 or 10 degree variance can mean all the difference between whether we have a wheat crop and a corn crop and a soybean crop at all. So we are in fact going to face very substantial cooling in the wheat belt and the breadbasket of the world right here in the Midwest over this next period. And those 5 to 10 degree average Fahrenheit temperature variations will spell the difference between whether we have a crop or whether we have a bad crop. There won't be a lot of good crops.
So we're looking at long, cold, frigid, snowy winters and short, cool, wet summers.
Pretty much. That's the ticket.
For 206 years.
Well, every 206 years, going back at least 1,200 years, like clockwork. It's amazing how the sun varies with such precision. And going back to your earlier comment, all the solar physics community is well aware of this, and the Al Gore side of the world ignores all of those obvious facts and obvious historical confirmations of how the sun drives climate. Unfortunately, the politics that's behind this global warming, man-made global warming, is really going to make things much worse for everyone, because most people are not aware of my book, all the research that scientists know about that tell us the Earth's getting colder rapidly. And so, as a result, most people on the planet will be totally unprepared when the first crops fail.
When do you expect to see the first evidence of crops failing?
Actually, I predicted it for the end of 2012, and it looks like it drifted a few months into 2013. We had a very long, cold, and now cold, wet spring. We've had a lot of damage to early planting already. The truth hasn't come out, but we're looking at a very bad start to planting season, both in Canada and here in the U.S. As you pointed out earlier, we had not only 3 feet of snow yesterday in the upstate Maine and Vermont, but we had cold weather all spring, very cold. In fact, April was one of the coldest months ever recorded globally.
I've been monitoring the farm journals from the wheat belt, and there was obviously an extremely cold season in the winter and spring, and they're referring to what they call the seed being burnt, being frozen in the ground. And the experts are saying, we won't know till June or July the extent of the damage that was done earlier this year. But it doesn't look good, John. I mean, it looks like the U.S. wheat belt got hit really hard.
It did, and the mainstream media hasn't picked up on it yet. You're obviously one of the few perceptive people in the media that's out there and follow these things, but that's exactly the case. This could be the first year where the bad news finally comes out that crop damage is real. And given the growth in population on the planet, again, we only had 1 billion the last time this 206-year cycle hit. We'll have 8 billion in 2031 at the bottom of the next cycle. But you don't have to get to the bottom before the damage occurs. I predicted it would start late last year, early this year, and it's already begun. As you may be aware, having read the book, all of my major climate predictions have come to pass.
I read a week or two ago that in Ireland, it's been so cold and wet, the potatoes aren't growing. And, as one Irish farmer said, there are no potatoes in Northern Ireland. They don't exist. I mean, John, we're seeing this all over the world. If somebody will do their research, they'll see the same reports are showing up around the world. Temperatures are dropping. Food production is being damaged. And this is just the beginning. This is the first year. And we're going to go deep into this. Now, I want to ask you, in a typical little ice age, do the temperatures continue to plummet year after year, for 100 years and then start to climb up? Or is it up and down? Do you have a year or two where it seems fairly normal and then followed by a really, cold freeze?
Yes, you have all of that. There are three major effects that occur during these cold cycles. The first is the overall effect, and what that means is that we reach a point in time and all of a sudden temperatures globally drop precipitously. They go into a trough and stay there for 1 or 2 decades, and then they come out sharply. So it's not a gradual drop and a gradual rise. It's a dramatic drop, stays at the bottom, and then comes out. Now, that's the general curve. The second issue is that what we find out in the historical records going back especially to the last 206-year cycle in the 1800s is that these solar hibernations are a confluence of major cold events clashing with warm events. The typical warm, moist air that comes out of the tropics will still be doing that with less intensity, but when it hits these very cold events, you see freak weather. For example, the last time this occurred, there were records of 90-degree temperatures in June and then freezing weather and snow in August. Now, that shows you the kind of fluctuation that occurs, but that is quite typical of these clash of dramatically cold, powerful fronts hitting the heated up tropic fronts that come up, and so that's another effect. The third effect, which also occurred in the last time period, is we see some of our very largest volcanic eruptions occur at the bottom of these cold cycles.
That was my next question. Why do volcanoes erupt at an increased rate during the cooling cycle?
There's been very little money put into answering that question. I don't have an answer for you. All I can tell you is that my research and that of other prominent geologists has shown that there's a very strong correlation between the worst earthquakes and the worst volcanoes as these solar hibernations commence. Likewise, this one has already started the same cycle again. I was recently honored in 2012, early 2012, being asked by some of the world's best earthquake scientists to form a new company because we now believe, or we believed then, that we could in fact predict the world's largest earthquakes. We've been doing that for a year. The success is remarkable, and this new International Earthquake and Volcano Prediction Center website is ievpc.org. We'll tell you all about that. But what we know from the history and the records, the last time we had a solar hibernation, Mount Tambora in Indonesia exploded. It was the largest recorded ever volcanic eruption. It covered the earth in dust, added to the cold that was already in place by 15 years. So the bottom of that cold cycle is made even worse. We had the worst ever series of earthquakes in the United States when the New Madrid Fault south of St. Louis erupted. We had roughly 3 magnitude 8.0 earthquakes within a few months of each other. It reversed the course of the Mississippi River. It flowed backwards until it redirected into its new path. But the worst ever earthquakes occurred, and so did the worst volcano during this solar hibernation that occurred last time. We're seeing the same effects. So we're getting ready for another round of major historic earthquakes and volcanic eruptions during the next solar hibernation.
So the sun, when it goes into this hibernation, obviously the planet cools, but for some unknown reason, there is an effect on the planet that we see more earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. The volcanic eruptions add ash to the atmosphere, which now cools the planet even more and reduces even greater food production, causing mass relocation of populations and all kinds of complications. I mean, this thing...
The ripple effects are huge, absolutely. We are no nonsense in our climate assessment in the Global Climate Status Report. We indicate that the extent of this new cold era will produce substantial cold, starvation, social upheaval, and loss of life globally for the next 30 years.
Will there be any regions of the planet that are tolerable?
Yes, and if you go back again and look at the records, the tropics were essentially unaffected by both cold eras, both the Little Ice Age and the last Dalton minimum, or the last time the 206-year cycle was at play in the 1800s. The tropics will always remain warm, but it's the mid and upper latitudes that suffer the most when these cold cycles come in. But that's where we grow our plants, unfortunately. That's where we grow our food.
So the tropics being a zone north and south of the equator all the way around the planet?
Right, 20 degrees north and south.
That's interesting. You and I, we both live here in Florida. How are we going to be doing here in Florida?
Well, a lot of people, including our government here in Florida, believes that we will be immune. That is simply not the case. And one example is the 1983 and 1985 freezes that we had here in Central Florida. We lost 200,000 acres of citrus, orange trees, back then. And that was a minor fluctuation, although a very real, measurable fluctuation in the sun's activity. We knew that was coming. We should have known. At least those of us who follow the sun could have said, hey, this is coming. But that was just merely a scratch of the surface of how cold it's going to be. So what we have been doing, we've tried to get the Secretary of Agriculture, Putnam, to wake up to what's coming. He has not, unfortunately. But we've made it very clear to the governor and all the key staff. I've been to Tallahassee to try to alert everyone there. We will probably lose the majority of what's left of our citrus crop here in Florida.
So Florida's citrus industry and perhaps its wintertime vegetable industry could be...
Winter vegetable, all the ornamental plants that we grow. We're in for the worst weather in the history of Florida.
Now, wait a minute. Think about this, John. I know I get a few minutes remaining here, but if the northern part of North America has long, cold, snowy winters and short, cold, wet summers, and they're not producing a lot of food, and in the wintertime, a lot of American cities count on Florida to send tomatoes and lettuce and oranges and everything north. If Florida's wintertime agricultural industry gets wiped out, what's the rest of the country eating?
That's the big question. Again, the last time this occurred, there was substantial loss of life. There were food riots, people attacking grain shipments. That's going to happen again. There's little doubt of that, in my opinion. All one has to do is study history. People haven't changed a lot fundamentally in 206 years. What's going to change fundamentally is that we're going to have the worst cold since our country was founded, and people will find lack of food. Now, on the other hand, I've been doing what I can to alert the global agricultural conglomerates, Archer Daniels Midland, ConAgra, Monsanto, and ADM, to start recognizing that they're going to have to shift global crop production completely to get us through this next cold period. What that means is, in answering your question, when things are really cold in the northern hemisphere, that means the southern hemisphere crop-growing regions are going to have to make up the difference.
And we're looking, again, a zone north of the equator, south of the equator, and, south of the equator, we're looking at, northern Brazil, Ecuador, Colombia, Mexico, the Caribbean. That's primarily what we're looking at. Well,
we're looking at only those parts of those countries that are near sea level. Mexico, for example, is relatively high latitude, most of it, mountainous and high latitude. That's why we see problems there too, because the higher the latitude, as you know from high school, you change your growing season, and it gets cold. And
So even if you're in the tropics, you don't want to be like someplace like Quito, Ecuador.
That's correct.
That's interesting. Hey, on top of this, with the food production being reduced by the cooling, then we had the massive die-off of honeybees, and the mysterious death of bats and frogs and toads, which, frogs and toads and bats eat bugs, which means you're going to have a lot of bugs, and the honeybees are dying, which are needed to pollinate the crops. You put all this together, you got a perfect storm, John.
Yes, you do. In fact, if you look at a lot of factors that we're going to contend with in the next decade or two, a lot of major ill effects are going to be hitting us at the same time, both environmental effects, climate effects, economic effects, population growth effects, earthquakes and volcanoes. It's not a good picture, but it means we better get everyone informed. We better get everyone prepared. That's why when I go throughout the country speaking, I give everyone the bad news, but I tell them it's the good news, however, is that you're hearing it for the first time, instead of the propaganda of man-made global warming, which has blinded everyone to what's really happening right now.
I agree.